Good evening, and a gentle and warm, peaceful welcome to this magnificent community and civic space, Melbourne Town Hall. My name is Michael Short. I write columns and editorials for The Age across a range of issues, including some of the things we're going to talk about tonight, and I am going to be your host. There's a fabulous panel. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my sincere respects to their elders, both past and present. I'd like to offer a special thanks tonight too to future leaders and their founder, Dr. Helen Sykes, AM, and to the organisation, fledgling but coming through, organisation Australians for Peace. They are co-conveners of tonight's event. Before we get cracking, I would like to invite my friend from years, Councillor Beverly Pinder-Mortimer. Bev is chair of the Marketing Melbourne Portfolio. She's deputy chair of the Arts and Culture Portfolio, so she has a lot of fun and has a big place in this town. She was instrumental in suggesting the idea for tonight's event. Please make Beverly welcome.
Thank you, Mike. May I too respectfully acknowledge that we are here on the land of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. Professor Megan Davis, Director, University of New South Wales Indigenous Law Centre and Chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Ms. Laura John, 2014 UN Australian Youth Ambassador. Dr. Dina McMillan, Social Psychologist and Consultant. Acting Assistant Commissioner Glenn Weir, Victorian Police. And my dear friend Michael Short, of course. Jane Nathan, Mike Zafiropoulos, Debbie Cations, who are committee members for Australians for Peace. Peace be with you. Good evening and welcome to the latest instalment in our Melbourne Conversations series on this day when we celebrate the ideals of peace around the world. When I first contemplated this discussion with Jeffrey, I was reminded of a powerful Charlie Chaplin speech from his iconic 1940 film, The Great Dictator. It was made 75 years ago, yet the sentiment still resonates. I would like to share an excerpt with you. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives us abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical. Our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. And without these qualities, life will be violent and all will be lost. You, the people, have the power. The power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. That was Charlie Chaplin. Our city is little different from cities around the world, supporting a largely peaceful and welcoming community, but dismayed by domestic and street violence. The City of Melbourne is listening to our community to develop solutions for a safer, more sociable city. Tonight, we would love you to join the conversation with our expert panel. It sounds so simple, but enduring peace is the most frustrating ambition of humankind. So I'm optimistic that individually we have kindness and empathy and a sense of justice. It doesn't matter what religion you choose, what country you come from, or what football club you support. The most fulfilled life is a shared life with compassion, love, and respect. We have a largely harmonious community, but we need to talk openly and freely about how we can make our city safer and more peaceful. So let's talk about values and prospects of peace in our time. Thank you and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.
Let's open the conversation. Melbourne Conversations is marking UN World Peace Day by asking something very important and profound, and that is how we might make Melbourne a safer and more peaceful city. Speaking of cities and peace, we've just seen some break out in Canberra after some pretty rugged battles, and there seems to be, picking up on what Bev was saying, a sense of optimism about the possibility to talk about ideas rather than the combat. I think that, if we've got a more important free market in the country than that for ideas, I'm not aware of it. So before I flesh out the topic just a little bit, I'd like to welcome to the stage, if you could come up one by one. I'll start with Professor Megan Davis. Megan, if you'd like to come and sit down, I'd like to welcome you. Megan is a Professor of Law at UNSW, anywhere you like. And at UNSW, she directs the Indigenous Law Centre, as Bev mentioned. As Beverly mentioned too, Megan is a member of, she's the chair of the UN's Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This is a huge honour. It's a huge honour and a hugely important role in our world, not just our country. She is a member of the expert panel on recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution, a hugely important topic as well, and to do with peace in our nation. She's the acting commissioner of the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, and when she's not swamped with all of that, she's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law and a member of the New South Wales Sentencing Council. Megan was the UN rapporteur for the International Expert Group meeting on combating violence against Indigenous women and girls. Megan, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to now introduce Dina, Dr. Dina McMillan. Dina is a social psychologist with both a master's and a PhD from Stanford in California. She's managing director of the McMillan Consulting Group, the eponymous group that advises governments and institutions. I love this bit that she's written, like FBI specialists who profile criminals, Dina has profiled the unique psychology of emotional abusers. This understanding has allowed her to identify the key tactics used to set up and maintain abusive relationships, and obviously we're going to have to go there tonight. It's a critical thing that she's done. It provides the first effective, easily understood prevention information in the field of domestic violence. Dina has published a groundbreaking book on this topic, but he says, and this is what's called, But He Says He Loves Me, How to Avoid Being Trapped in a Manipulative Relationship. Third, I'd like to introduce Laura John. Last year, Laura was the Australian UN Youth Representative, and in that role she engaged, this is amazing, she engaged with over 13,000 young Australians in every state and territory. She's managed to do a law degree in the middle of all of this too, and has just moved to Canberra where she's practising law for the first time this year. She's delivered a speech to the UN General Assembly on the importance of good mental health, resilience and well-being, and I think we're going to touch on mental health and other sort of coping issues this evening too, as we look at some of the things that are detracting from the potential peace we can have in our community. She's previously worked for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. She's also worked with a fabulous organisation called Oak Tree Foundation, which is a youth-run organisation committed to ending extreme poverty. She is also, by the way, the current Sri Lankan Youth of the Year in Australia. Finally, Glenn Weir. Glenn is Acting Assistant Commissioner for Victoria Police. He's ranged across many areas of the force since starting as a cadet in 1980.
I was 3.
He came in from the country and has been helping keep Melbourne nice, or as nice as he can. He's currently the Divisional Commander of the Brimbank Division of Victoria Police's Northwest Metro Region, which is a mouthful, but it is a big area. And out there, he's overseen the development and implementation of an extensive CES, community engagement strategy that guides police under his command in there, and it seems pretty successful efforts to meet goals around community safety. Okay, it's a compelling and fascinating idea. How do we make Melbourne safer? How do we build a better city? This city is a serial recipient of the most livable city in the world, so there's this, I'm grappling with a paradox. It's a city in a country that is recognised for decency. There are people throughout the world who are prepared to die to have a chance to approximate what we have here. That's huge. That's significant. But nevertheless, it's also true to say that if you're a woman in this community, if you're a woman in the world's most livable city, and this is a nationwide problem, the greatest preventable threat to your health and indeed to your very life, is violence by a partner or a former partner. This is not peaceful. We've got in Victoria a Royal Commission on Family Violence. We have Rosie Batty as Australian of the Year because of family violence. We have the federal government spending $100 million on trying to reduce family violence by raising awareness and through other measures. And so far this year, 62 women have been killed by their partner or former partner. It's been running at about one a week for years. So in this year, we've got ostensibly, and Glenn will talk to this later, I should think, a problem that's getting worse. As many as half a million Australian women in the last year have reported violence, sexual or physical, in the home. So is it getting worse? We're going to come to that. As Megan Davis has written, the most vulnerable and marginalised group in our nation is Indigenous women. Then there are also evidently the cases of street violence that make parents worried, make young people worried, make people wary of even coming into the CBD, particularly on a Friday and Saturday night, certain areas of it anyway. I often wonder if the media is part of the problem. I ponder this all the time. We hold a distorted view of the world up to you. Here the paradox gets even worse for me. It is true also to say that most people in Melbourne got up today and were engaged with people, places, things and ideas. We're kind to each other. We're supportive. We're loving. But you don't see that in the newspapers. Maybe we should see more of that. My wife, Sophie, was here in this very building today because she's the Vice President of the Queen's Fund, the oldest charity in this country. They did 80 cases today. The Queen's Fund deals with women and children who are tipping over the edge into crisis and poverty. And it can be financial, the fridge goes bung, and that's it. They're that tight. Today they did 50. They did 100 cases. 50 of them were directly the result of family violence. 50 of them, directly. So tonight we're going to examine what is going so wrong, as well as trying to see it in the context of what we do right. But we have heartbreaking, gut-wrenching criminality going on in this place, and women are a disproportionate target. This is utter bastardry. So how indeed can we create a more peaceful place? How can that be done? What can we do individually? What is going on in the community? I'm going to ask each of the panellists to talk for 5 minutes, and then we're going to throw it open to discussion here and then throw it open to discussion with you. You came up last, Glenn. Perhaps we could start with you, and in broad terms, the notion of whether or not things are getting better. Have things improved in the broad in the last 30 years?
And I suppose that's the difficult piece, is compared to what? Napoleon, I think, said once that one death's a tragedy and 1,000's a statistic. So from a utopian point of view, I suppose, from a policing service, the fact that we have one crime means that there's one too many. And every time there's a high profile, which I always, people talk about high profile crimes, like a Luke Batty or a Jill Maher. What makes that high profile? Is it only because it's in the media? Any crime against any person has a significant impact on that person. So I do often, people ask, in 33 years of policing, have things got worse? Well, not for me, because I'm still essentially providing the same service at a different level that I provided when I was a 19-year-old constable who fresh, from the country, and been to Melbourne twice in my life, and the most difficult and aggressive situation I'd had to deal with was a cow getting angry at me when it wouldn't come in for milking. And all of a sudden, in my 5th week of policing, I was walking down Little Collins Street and walked right into the middle of an armed robbery where a guy was holding up a bank with a bomb in 1982. I can't remember the last time that happened. So if things got better, well, probably, from my perspective. So it is a matter of perspective. And when you think about, and you talked about a paradox before, and I suppose from a policing perspective, the paradox is that if we do our job really effectively, we'll actually do ourselves out of business. And I would love to see the day that the state of Victoria is not spending multi-billion dollars on a policing service, but was reinvesting that money in social capital, infrastructure, education, health, all the things that would be really fantastic. But, realistically, would we ever see the day that our policing service was wound back? When you look at our numbers of police per 100,000 head of population, we are not up with other jurisdictions in Australia or across the world. Do more police make for a safer environment? Who knows? Police in the right place doing the right things with proper capacity and capability certainly make a difference. And the thing that undoes us is every time, for every great story or great piece of service delivery that we do, one negative story about someone who hasn't done the right thing undermines the whole core of what we're trying to do. And I often look back at the Peelian principles that, Sir Robert Peel back in the early 1820s, who established the framework for modern policing. And some of the values that he espoused still really resonate today with what we're trying to do. The police can only succeed if they have the cooperation of the public. The public, my view always has been if society was able to be self-governing and take away the need for an intrusive police service, it'd just be a fantastic place to live. If we had the basic tenets of respect for each other, respect for our environment, respect for the way we go about our day-to-day business, the need for a policing service would be significantly reduced. At a base level, and I laugh every time I look at 50-50 and people bang on about speed cameras and all that sort of thing. And I just thought, if no one broke the speed limit, we wouldn't need speed cameras. If we're able to self-govern, self-manage, have self-respect, we would be in a so much better place. But of course, they're all utopian ideals that if probably from a policing perspective, if you didn't have that aspirational goal to develop a community, whether you're a brand new constable or an acting assistant commissioner, it doesn't matter. It's in your span of control and your scope of influence. If you weren't trying to achieve that, then you're not doing your job. And that's not just policing, that's across whole levels of society. So if things got better, have things got worse? It depends very much on a point of view. We live in a safe, vibrant, accepting, tolerant democracy. In a lot of places in the world, as destructive it is, you would not be able to have a demonstration where people on the right who were opposed to certain things were in the same street as people from the left who were diametrically opposed, and we're in the middle facilitating a sort of peaceful conflict. In a lot of places you wouldn't be able to do that. you can do that here. So whilst there are always areas we can improve from the provision of a policing service, but also as a society and a community, we will always be looking to continually improve. But I'm really confident that we are achieving results and that Melbourne is a really good place to live.
We'll come back to a number of those issues, Glenn. Thank you for that. Laura, would you like to say a few words now, please?
Well, I haven't been alive for 30 years, so I'm probably not the best panellist to talk about a comparison about what it was like 30 years ago. But what I found really interesting was in preparation for today's event, I did a quick survey amongst my friends and family, and I asked them, what do you think of when you hear world peace? I got some good answers. I got harmony, multiculturalism. Someone said they thought of the white dove with the olive branch, but the overwhelming answer that I got was, isn't that something that beauty pageant contestants say that they want to help achieve? I'm sure you've all seen those Miss World competitions where they're asked, and what do you want to achieve, or what do you want the most? And the contestant says, world peace. So I think in this conversation, the interesting thing is, well, how do we take this broader concept and notion of world peace into something that's actually tangible and objective at a community and grassroots level? And for World Peace Day last year, I was really lucky. I was at the UN in New York. And so there are big celebrations there. There's galas and ceremonies, and that's all really wonderful. But just last week, I was in Cowra, which is in regional New South Wales, at another International Day of Peace event. And what that reminded me was that I think the real promise of World Peace Day and things like that is how it's actually implemented in our communities. And so in Cowra, they're actually home to the Australian Peace Bell, which is a pretty big deal. Apparently there's only 23 Peace Bells in the world, and Australia has been awarded one, and it sits in Cowra. And I was at this youth forum, so talking to a group of high school students about issues of peace in their community. And this one particular group of students were talking to me about how there is this kind of a few kids in that school who cause trouble. So at recess, during class times, they're the ones who are throwing things at the teacher, starting fights, not willing to kind of engage with the education system, and they're all known as the naughty kids. I'm sure you can probably remember who were those kids when you went to school. I know I can. And so these students were talking about, well, we really want to do something about this small minority group of young people who, in our school who aren't really embodying those values of peace. And I thought that their solution was fantastic, because they said, what we should do is we should work with these young people. We should start with education, but we should actually give them the opportunity to run a project on their own. So give them a leadership role, tell them you're going to be in charge of driving this initiative to do X, and really give these young people an opportunity to focus their energy on something that was really positive. And so I think for me, when we talk about peace and how do we promote Melbourne as a more livable city, it really needs to start with education. And I think that education needs to be preventative. So we need to start at a young age, teaching people about things like, well, what does a respectful society look like at a base level? And I think that this also leads into the other topic we want to talk about tonight, which is domestic violence. Because I'm not sure that that necessarily starts at the violence. I think it probably starts before that at an idea or a particular mindset about the role of women in society that then develops into this devaluing of women. So I think we need to invest more in these programs which talk about respectful relationships. So what does it mean to be in a happy, healthy relationship with someone? How do you resolve conflicts? Because they will arise, not using violence. So I guess for me, there is a lot of different pieces to this puzzle of peace. And I think probably the biggest learning that I took out of the consultations I did last year with young Australians and community organisations was that all of these issues are very interrelated. So as Michael said, domestic violence is related to mental health, which is related to education, which has an impact on homelessness. So I think that when we look at tackling these issues, we've really got to look at the broader puzzle and not just those individual puzzle pieces.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, it's a fascinating, empowering idea you're talking about. Dina, I know you had a different view on the 30-year question, but please have the floor.
Okay. Well, first of all, because this is Melbourne, I was so excited to do this in the city, because this city's not just known for being livable, it's also known for being willing to tackle the tough topics, to really consider new ideas. So it's known as that's one of the reasons I moved to Australia, because I kept seeing all the social innovation. And I'd look, and I said, it kept saying the people doing it were Australian. And then I looked up the population of Australia, and when I moved here a decade ago, it was, 21 million or something like that, and which is less than half the size of my state of California. So, but I have to beg indulgence of the people here, because in order for me to discuss the piece that I came to talk about, it's a little challenging, because I had an epiphany, a personal epiphany, and I came up with a project and an idea. And having been in Australia for a decade, it's hard to do that, because it'd be great if it was somebody else's idea that I could just promote it and people wouldn't think, oh my God, she's up herself, you know. So just, I'm asking your indulgence about that, and also that what I do is a paradigm shift. So think about this for a second. When we have information about peace, when, Shalom Bayat is something that when I work with the Jewish community, they talk about peace in the home. And peace doesn't just mean being quiet. When you talk about respectful relationships and conflict resolution, it should include the fact that you also should have a relationship where your view can actually be heard. Because a lot of women keep the peace by just keeping quiet and repressing their views. But what happened is I went to university for 9 years. 9 years of torture, yes. And then I worked for 9 years in the domestic violence field and the relationship field. And then I was working with some survivors of very violent domestic abuse. And I had an epiphany, literally had an epiphany. And I realized a couple of things. Number one, because I studied social psychology, which is the study of influence and interaction and brainwashing and coercion and all of these really manipulative, evil things, combined with having so much exposure to, at that point, I'd had exposure to, I had had in-depth conversations and had counseled more than 2,500 victims and more than 630 abusers in confidential sessions where they were very open with me about what they thought. And I realized I saw something, and I could write it down, and not only that, I could teach it. But it is a little shocking, because most of the time, all of us want to think the way we behave is so individual, so unique. And those of us who work in my field, we know that's not necessarily very true. I was seeing a small subset of tactics in every abuser and the story of every survivor I was talking to, whether they came from South America, whether they were Anglo, Aboriginal, Black American, Maori, whatever they were. And so understanding that those tactics are discernible, and they start at the very beginning of the relationship with emotional and psychological abuse. So those of you who know about this field know if you get rid of the emotional and psychological abuse, you automatically get rid of the violence. Because that's the premise, that's the foundation of an abusive relationship. No one's going to go on a first date and just smack someone and expect that person to stay with them. They have to build up to that. But we also, as a society, have a resistance to giving women the power directly to protect ourselves. So what do we have? We have respectful relationships in the schools. And that's great to know what a respectful relationship is, except abusers are really good at pretending. Part of the abusive tactic that I identified is not only a willingness, but a real skill at manipulative behavior and lying and deception and psychological manipulation, which by definition is using deception and abusive or underhanded tactics to manipulate someone else's emotions and beliefs. So if they know what a healthy relationship is, and you don't teach them what these tactics look like, Someone comes along, promises to be Prince Charming, and she's stuck. But we also, I believe, have got to teach women. Now, I've had a lot of people, everybody wants to do the training for the guys, or they want to train the kids. My core group is 14 to 90, and primarily female. Now, I have training I also do with my Unmasking the Abuser program, which is what I decided to call my program. Again, apologies. If it were somebody else's program, I'd be able to tell you about it without feeling really weird and self-conscious. Thank you for being in Australia. Okay, if I were in the States, I'd be okay. You know what we're like. But for the first time, I realized, give me 2 hours with women, and that includes time for a tea break, bathroom break, and questions. And I can teach women what it looks like so that they see it at the very beginning stage. And if it's already happened, they can identify it and say, wait a minute, like they do afterwards, I'm not crazy. He was abusive. He is abusive. This is what we need to do, because in order to start having a peaceful society, we have to have peace in the home. And that means everybody in the home looking forward to going home, looking forward to the other people that live there coming home, having mutual respect in the home. So that's what I do.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure we're going to come back to what some of those markers might look like. Megan, would you like to speak for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it to a conversation between the four of you?
No, well, I don't think these notes are very helpful now. I might pick up on what some other people have said.
Please.
First of all, in relation to Melbourne, I know nothing about Melbourne. If you want to know whether or not Aboriginal people think Melbourne is a peaceful place, I think the Aboriginal people of Melbourne are the ones to ask. I would say probably Adam Goods doesn't find Melbourne or Victoria a very peaceful place to visit, that's for sure. Just picking up on what Laura said, I think the peace bells in Cowra, because of the Cowra breakout, and I think that's a really interesting part of Australian history, because of the POW camp there and the POWs that were killed when there was the breakout. And your point about education is an important one, because for Aboriginal people, Australia is a pretty not very peaceful, unsafe place. And I think Stan Grant wrote quite a great piece in The Guardian today, actually, about Adam's decision, we think, not to do a grand final lap. I don't follow AFL, but a grand final lap for fear of being booed. I think it's really important to say from the outset that, you know, the history of Aboriginal people and Australia is one of violence. If we move past the conciliation phase straight into the phase that is categorised as what we call the frontier wars, or the killing times, the political economy of the settlement of Australia was massacres, was killing. And there are a number of significant massacres that occurred on this country and in this state. And that continued into the protection era, and then into the post-protection era, the assimilation phase. An interesting point there in relation to the police, because you had a situation where police were the enforcers of the protection era, and virtually overnight then they had to become the enforcers of the rule of law. And there's always been that tension there between Aboriginal people and the police for that. And moving into the self-determination era and what we have now, which is some bizarre form of bipartisanship / neo-paternalism. I'm not sure how to describe it. But in terms of this continent and probably this city, I can't speak for the Aboriginal people in this audience, it is certainly not one that we would describe as a peaceful existence or a city of peace. And I think that's an important thing to, I suppose, put on the table up the front if we're going to talk about things like education, to really understand the extent of, I suppose, I think Jeffrey wanted to talk about domestic violence and violence in the Aboriginal community in respect to International Peace Day, then we should be upfront and honest about the kind of history of Australia too, and that education that's simply not taught to Australians. I'll stop on that note. I can
Okay.
keep going though. If you...
Keep going.
No, I'm joking. I'm just joking.
All right, well, look, there's a related issue that I wanted to sort of get into in terms of peace and violence and domestic and social, and that is the role of two things about which awareness has been rising. Mental illness and substance abuse or substance misuse and addiction. There's so much self-medication going on in the community. Glenn, could we start with you perhaps and just sort of examine the causal or coincidental elements here?
Yeah, and it's a really hard issue to nail because it is in essence the ultimate chicken or the egg, I think. A lot of times we're just seeing that poly abuse structure of drug and alcohol use and abuse and the line that's crossed and the impact on mental health, family violence, volume crime, social disadvantage, and whether or not the use is associated because of the existing social disadvantage or whether it's a causal factor or whether it's all part of the big mix. And in my experience, I mean, having worked a lot in the drug enforcement field at different levels, and essentially, whilst the media focus and talk about crystal methamphetamine, ice, which is the real big ticket item at the moment, yet I still in Brimbank have more people die of heroin overdoses than die from use of ice, perhaps from a therapeutic perspective, but the risky behaviours that are associated with drug abuse may lead to other deaths. But it seems to have been missed because your point earlier, Mike, about the media and good news stories don't sell. There are no newspaper sales in how well things are going. To be blunt, death and destruction sells. You look at even television journalism now, which has become, in essence, someone doing some talking around vision from CCTV or GoPro cameras or dash cams. It's really lazy journalism in a lot of cases, but that's what the populace seems to want. So that mix of what the public know because that's what they see, as opposed to what the real harm and that undercurrent of what all of us, I suppose, as professionals in health, mental health particularly, law enforcement, any support agency, it is a really difficult piece to try and unpack the cause and effect. Having said that, mental health issues now are so prevalent in what we're doing on a daily basis, and it just it does worry me. It worries me as from an occupation, but it also worries me as a parent and as a citizen. I mean, where is the mental health sector going? They're struggling. We've got some of the best people I've ever met are in mental health service provision, yet they, more than anyone, a lot of focus is on the service providers around family violence and drug and alcohol, but the mental health providers who are captured in that sector as well are really under the pump. So that does concern me a lot.
Some of this, Laura, goes to optimism and perception of human nature, and I'd be interested in everybody's view about this from if you want, with different anecdotes perhaps, but do you think people are good? I mean, it's not. I mean, it sounds like, but it's not black and white. Obviously, there's good. But are you optimistic about people being decent?
I mean, I'm definitely optimistic about that. And I think what Glenn said about the perception we have of our community and the stories that make it in the media, it also feeds into that. And I know that before spending all of last year travelling around talking to different people, I probably had a little bit of a skewed view about street violence and the role of young people in those issues. But there are so many good news stories all around the country of, I mean, young people is really my demographic of young people doing great things, you know, building peace in their communities, taking the initiative. But those stories just, I think, don't get the profile that they deserve. But in terms of mental health and drugs and alcohol, those two issues were actually in the top 5 issues that young Australians self-identified as issues of concern. So mental health was number 2 behind education, and drugs and alcohol was number 4 behind environment, which was number 3. So I think these are issues which the community itself is able to identify as issues of concern. And in terms of the mental health aspect, something that really stuck with me was last year I got this email from this young Victorian woman, and her name is Cass. And she sent me this email, and she started off by saying, you know, "Dear Laura, really sorry that I wasn't able to come and meet with you today. The reason I couldn't come was ill health." So that was the phrase that she used. And then she went on to explain further on in her email that actually that's only really half of the story, because it's not a physical illness that prevented her from attending. It was a mental health problem. And so what she was talking about was this stigma that we still have around discussing mental health. And it's a stigma that I think prevents people from reaching out and seeking the support that they need early on. And then these problems develop into bigger issues, which then connect with the other issues we're talking about tonight in terms of violence. So I think, I mean, from my perspective, one of the key things we really need to get better at doing is talking about mental health, but talking about it in the same way that we talk about physical health. So we talk about physical health in terms of go for a run every day, exercise for 30 minutes. But when we think about mental health, I think we're still jumping to mental illness and mental health problems and not kind of talking about, well, how do we just check in with ourselves, build that resilience and promote our well-being day to day?
Yeah, it's a huge area too, isn't it? There are, 4 million Australians this year enduring some mental health issues, and those statistics are pretty staggering. Stark. They're not staggering, they're normal. Dina, the notion of respect is really profoundly important here in this sort of set of topics that we're talking about. And somebody once said something that stuck with me, which was, if you made a rule for yourself that you would not speak to your partner, your spouse, in a way that you wouldn't speak to a colleague. So if you kept yourself as nice at home as you know, we don't, even if we're feeling really troubled, we don't lash out at colleagues generally. Mm-hmm. Generally, yeah. It happens, doesn't it? Would that help?
Absolutely. I know that I had a partner many years ago, and we used to argue quite a bit. And so when our relationship ended, one of the things I don't know how many, are there any other social scientists in here? Okay, because one of the things that I do was that, I hope I'm not offending you, but one of the things I do, whenever I would learn something, the first person I would apply it to was myself. So every time I learned something about how to have better relationships with people, or how to do this or how to do that, I'd say, "Ooh, goody," and then I'd use it myself. So I know that with my husband, one of the things he will probably tell you if he were sitting here is that one of the reasons he decided to be with me is because he was with women who were very passionate. I'm very, as you can tell, very intense and passionate about what I do. But I don't give myself permission to ever call anyone anything other than what their name is. I don't care what my mood is. I don't care what my stress level is. I don't give myself permission. So no matter how angry I get, I don't raise my voice, and I don't call anyone a name. And it's an amazing thing, because it's more than just having a principle. It's firmer than that. I don't give myself permission. It's that simple. And one of the things I just wanted to briefly mention is about alcohol. One of the challenges I have here is this is a very drinking culture. And it's really interesting for those of you who don't know that in cultures where they do not excuse violence because someone is drunk, they don't even try to use that as an excuse. If you have a principle, if you don't give yourself permission to yell, scream, hit, misbehave, insult someone, hit below the belt. If you tell yourself, I don't care what's going on, I don't have that permission, just because you're drinking, you probably want to be one of those overly friendly people. Oh man, I love you, one of those kind of people, but you're not going to be mean. You're not going to be horrible. Ice worries me because it does cause a type of brain damage that other drugs often don't. But we give people an excuse with alcohol, and we need to take our excuse back. They need to be held accountable socially and legally as if they were sober. And we also need to investigate why people feel they need to drink so much. So when you're talking about mental health, what is it that they need in their lives that they think alcohol will fill that void? We need to work on that too.
Thank you, Dina. Megan, it would be remiss of me, given that you're on the expert panel and in this context, and you were sort of giving a potted history before of the sort of various overarching policies, sort of, and a version of self-determination now, but a version. Do you have optimism? Do you see any progress? And that generally and specifically, do you think that the constitutional reform will occur will occur, and will it be good?
Well, I'm more optimistic now that we have a Prime Minister who's a constitutional lawyer. That helps. And I say that because one of the problems since the recognition, I suppose, project began with, I suppose, Julia Gillard more formally in terms of the expert panel, is this word recognition. And in Australia it tends to give rise, because of the kind of very poor media analysis of this issue, to a kind of an assumption that we're talking about a symbolic form of recognition, which is a statement of words or a statement of fact about the existence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples somewhere in the Constitution. But that's not at all what the project is about. In fact, I don't want to talk for all the Aboriginal people in the room, but I would say the majority of Aboriginal people I've been involved with over the past 5 or 6 years on this issue aren't really concerned about being recognised by the Australian people. That's not an issue. We don't need to be recognised. It's more about substantive forms of recognition, and what will that look like. So it might be one suggestion the expert panel made was a racial non-discrimination clause. A suggestion from the Cape York Institute and Noel Pearson is for a kind of democratic advisory body. There's many kinds of forms of recognition around the world, but up until now, the one that it looked like the government was looking at was a kind of very thin form of symbolic recognition that wouldn't lead to the kind of change that we want to see in our communities, and the kind of change we want to see in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal people and the state. So I'm optimistic since last, Wednesday? Monday? This Monday? No, last week, I think. Yeah.
I think it was Tuesday.
Yeah, it's been a while.
But up until, it got a little bit depressing in the past couple of weeks. Nothing actually has happened in that space. I know there's quite dramatic changes in other policy areas. Nothing's happened in the Aboriginal space under the new Prime Minister yet, so we'll wait and see. But I think it's a really important, I still think it's a really important thing, constitutional recognition. It's just, can we work with the Australian people to get them to a point where they understand that substantive recognition is actually going to lead to change in Aboriginal communities and is more likely to close the gap than some form of, token language at the beginning of the Constitution.
Would you say the gap is, in all its many forms, the biggest barrier to greater peacefulness in our nation?
No, I think it's the other thing. So one of the problems we have is that there's been a kind of false dichotomy created when we look at reconciliation between symbolic and the practical. I think Prime Minister John Howard was very effective of setting up that paradigm. Now, what closing the gap is, and what Reconciliation Australia does, is focus on what are citizenship rights. They're things that you should have by virtue of being a citizen.
The other stuff is what we call unfinished business, which is to say the issue of sovereignty hasn't been resolved yet in Australia. It is a legal fact that Aboriginal people didn't cede the land. We know that the High Court came to a kind of unsatisfactory result in Mabo in relation to that, but we have what we have. There needs to be some sort of dealing with that fundamental question of sovereignty. And then from there, you know, what is the process in terms of how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in this democracy and live alongside Australians going forward. I think the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation got quite a long way down that track, but it was abandoned by the Howard government. In addition to that, with the Mabo decision in the High Court, there was a three-prong approach to the Mabo decision, the first being the Native Title Act, which is how these people now going to receive their native title. The second was the Indigenous Land Fund, which was for Aboriginal people who would not be entitled to native title because it would have been extinguished. And the third plank of the Mabo, I suppose, settlement was what's known as the social justice package, which is to address all the unfinished business I'm speaking about. That package was developed by ATSIC and it has never been implemented. So I like to look at this issue in terms of, you know, there's two sides to the same coin. One is closing the gap, Reconciliation Australia, that's citizenship rights. But the other side, which is what are your rights that are distinct to you as the first peoples of this country who have a long-held connection to the land. What flows from that? Well, we've never, ever really resolved that in this country. If you look comparatively at our common law cousins, they have better health outcomes, better health and well-being. We can see the reason for that is they have strong formal substantive recognition. They have treaties, reserve seats, you know, they have quite strong land title. They often have charters and bills of rights also that enable them to pick, you know, I suppose draw upon different rights at particular times that they might need them. So Aboriginal women, for example, in Canada have used the equality provision in the Canadian Charter to litigate against Aboriginal men who've set up policies that have excluded them. So there's a whole raft of quite strong form recognition in other jurisdictions, which we think is one of the reasons why health and disadvantage is better. Sorry, that sounds terrible. Why things are better in Canada, New Zealand, the US, Scandinavia than they are in Australia.
Thank you.
If I could give my 2 cents worth as to why I think maybe alcohol is a problem in Australia. I grew up in country South Australia where pursuits were playing football and sport in general, and if you had any interests at all, be they intellectual or musical, you really weren't encouraged to talk too much about them because it didn't really go hand in hand with drinking. And I think in a way that the people, and I don't mean to castigate everyone, but they were probably a little intellectually and emotionally constipated, maybe at that age, that's what you are, and alcohol was the easy way out. You could just get a little drunk and you'd loosen up that way, but by the time you loosened up, you weren't capable of holding a decent conversation. Whereas myself, I was probably a bit unusual. I'd much prefer to sit around a campfire talking about the stars or something like that, but it just it just never happened. So and I just think if you get off to that sort of start, it might be more difficult to veer from that track. But anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. Very narrow experience back then, I'm sure.
But as a quick response,
No, thank you.
as a quick response to that, did anybody see the Q&A with Rosie Batty and what is her name, Natasha Despoja?
Yes.
It was months ago, but they had a man on from the Northern Territories, and he was singing the praises of a professional athlete who had brutalized his wife, and then the court ordered him to apologize to his teammates. And so this person who works in a men's behavior change program had the guy read. He showed the film of the guy doing it. He read off a piece of paper and blamed all of his misbehavior on the fact that he was drunk. And then the guy comes back, oh, isn't he great? Look how he took responsibility. And I just worried that so often what I teach in my seminars is how the brain works. I do it really quickly, but I teach people how the brain works and how things like that influence us, even if we aren't really paying close attention. And then, so the next time somebody blames something on alcohol, anybody that saw that, because it wasn't contested by the audience or anyone on the panel, so the next time somebody did something bad and blamed it on alcohol, the vast majority of people watching that Q&A would buy it, because it was just given a tick of approval, a tacit tick of approval, by not being contested.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
Because I think that's a really important point. Because in the research that we've done, which is to track kind of the evidence base about what works and what doesn't work in Aboriginal communities in terms of alcoholism or, it's family violence broadly. Behavioural change programs, there's just not enough evidence to suggest they do work. In fact, there's not a lot of evidence for most programs that they do or don't work, which is...
Because most of them are not like me. I'm evidence-based everything.
Yeah, no. But I mean, I suppose that's my concern about the way this year and the kind of focus on DV has been.
Me too.
And some of the campaigns, there's a lot of... it's worrying. There's a lot of non-technicians in the field, a lot of non-experts, a lot of people who are being thrust into the spotlight as DV kind of not champions, the reverse. But it's actually a very, very complex...
No, but don't you realise it's the police. Everything's their fault.
Well,
Don't you watch TV? That's what all of these people say.
We're the one constant, so that's good that it is our
everything's
fault.
the fault of the government.
But I take your point, because you can get away with anything, it seems, if you apologise.
Don't get me started on that fake rumors.
But look at, every time a sportsman mucks up, the sporting club media person will present them to the media and read a prepared statement and say they're sorry. And off we go and we'll move on. And we, from a professional point of view, I see it all the time, that behaviours, everyone's sorry. Well, and I say,
They're sorry they got caught. Yes.
That's
Although
a great
you think
constant.
if a Rihanna would sing that, she'd pay attention to it. Good God, her taste in men. If I could get a hold of Rihanna. Anybody know Rihanna? Please hook a sister up, okay? Because she's a mess. Chris Brown is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
He was sorry he got caught, and very, very insincere, and he still got away with it.
And that brings, and I often look at, it just seems this ever-developing sense of entitlement.
Yes.
As a society that we have. We're entitled to a second chance and a fair go. Well, yeah, okay, well, what's that mean? Does that mean you haven't learned anything and you just want to be told sorry? I'm entitled to a lot of things. Well, I think the more we perpetuate that sense of entitlement without people taking responsibility for their own actions, without displaying respect across a whole spectrum from parents, kindergarten, school, teammates, through marriage, we just end up creating a much more violent vortex that goes round and round and round, and in the end we get to a point where it might not be retrievable. I mean, I still think we live in a fantastically safe community, broadly speaking, with pockets of real challenge and real disadvantage and real problem. But overall, from a perspective of World Peace Day, I mean, I'm happy to say that I live, and that's easy for me to say as a middle-aged white Protestant Australian who early 50s, thank you, Jane, who grew up with loving parents and have had a good career and have lucky to have had a couple of kids so that's easy for me to sit up here and say, because I haven't had the social disadvantage. But I've seen a lot of it, so I probably have a balanced view of what it looks like. But the Australian alcohol culture that you've touched on, as someone who's come to our country and observed it from a different cultural aspect, is something that's really interesting for me.
Laura, thank you. Good.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would touch on what Glenn then just mentioned in terms of this violent vortex, I think you called it, and how we need to kind of work across the spectrum from schools and parents and families and political leaders to really tackle this issue. And I think that's quite true, because one of the key recommendations that came out of my work last year was about the need for more mentors and more positive role models, particularly for young people that come from within their community itself, so people who are relatable, not the necessarily, pop stars and celebrities. And I met this great young guy called Josh when I was in Elliot in the Northern Territory, who's like 18 years old. He's gone through high school, finished high school successfully, which is a pretty big deal for him. And instead of moving to Darwin or moving interstate and kind of going to university and following that path, he actually decided that he really wanted to stay in his community in Elliot and to work with the other young, predominantly Indigenous kids in that area. And I was able to see the way that he interacts with those young people, and he's just so incredibly respected, and he's such a great role model, showing these young people what they can actually achieve and trying to steer them away from, drugs and alcohol and some of those issues. So I think in terms of what you're talking about, a really practical way that we as a community can help in this regard is to really invest in mentors. I know I've got several wonderful mentors in Melbourne and beyond, and I think that's a really key way that we can make a difference on a community-based level.
My question's for Glenn, I suppose, mainly about mental health of police officers themselves and whether that's being addressed or how it's being addressed in the community. And I guess some of the assumptions around what we think a police officer is in terms of things like strength and toughness, and whether that's actually impacting on their ability to have a good relationship with the community and deal with people who are experiencing mental illness, as often first responders they have to do.
Yeah, it's a really good question, thanks. And it is something we're investing a lot in, because, to be brutally frank, we've been so far behind the 8 ball, and we're made up of people who come from society. So as society changes and people are made up of different DNA, then the needs are different. So certainly, I look back to when I first joined and was involved in, some nasty incidents, some shootings and that, and the way to deal with that was you were taken out and have a few drinks and have a few more drinks, then go home, and magically in the morning you'll wake up and everything will be fine. And everything wasn't fine. And I think, we've been similarly, and I've been doing a bit of work in this space, so it's interesting to see what's happening in a lot of other jurisdictions internationally, that everyone is recognising that the cumulative effect of a number of small incidents can have a significantly diabolical effect. So that if often as a 23 or 24-year-old first responder, you're called to an incident involving someone who's had a long history of mental health, drug and alcohol abuse, your ability to deal with that person is somewhat limited based only on your experience and your training. But after 10 or 15 years of doing that, you get really good at talking to those people, because unfortunately you probably become a little more like part of the problem than part of the solution. So for us to identify that and to put some fixes in, because that has an economic benefit, that's an economic question as well for all you taxpayers who are paying to fund the police force, who you don't want them to be off work. You don't want them to be making poor decisions due to stress and due to that vicarious sort of stress that is. So I really take your point, and that's not just policing. To be honest, that's across the whole support sector. I mean, as I mentioned before, some of the people that I deal with and that I've seen in the support services network, I just shake my head at their resilience and their toughness. And I mean, one of the most simple, are you okay day? I mean, are you okay? I say to my people, are you okay day is every day. Mm-hmm. It's not just a slogan once a year. It's actually as simple as saying, how you going, everything all right? And building up that understanding as a leader. And it's not just a policing issue, it's all of us. It comes back to that I spoke about respect. Respect for yourself, respect for others means identifying those triggers as well.
I think if there's a word that will, if you mapped tonight, the word that would pop out a lot would be respect. self-respect community across the board. There was another question over here. Oh, there's one here, then over here.
Yeah, my name's Heather. I'm a psychologist, and I'd just like to take slight issue with the notion that mental illness is exactly like a physical illness, because I think it leads us straight down a medical model in responding to it if we think it's just an illness to be treated. We keep hearing about mental illness, seek help, and treatments are much more complex than that. They don't always work, whether you're talking about therapy or drugs or whatever. And just joining the dots between what some people have said, like Glenn said, cops don't just get depressed out of nowhere. They've seen something really hideous happen and they're not sure how to respond to it, and that takes its toll. Family violence is a huge predictor of mental health problems in many women. If you look at what's happening to Buddy Franklin and Adam Goods, the things that have happened to them, they at least in part come out of racism, their Aboriginality and different reactions to that, and who knows, how far back that goes. But it seems to me that if we just say it's an illness, go and get help, it's terribly oversimplifying of that issue of mental health. And the same with a lot of the things we're talking about. I don't think that family violence is just a matter of education. It's a matter of changing the sort of whole culture of who's entitled to be on top and why being on top matters and all that kind of thing. It's much more complex than just saying be nice to each other. And I guess that's just a comment, but it worries me sometimes when we sometimes oversimplify it into an individual solution, even though psychologists are probably the most guilty of that as anybody. So I guess I'd just be interested in comments on that. Thank you.
Who would like to?
I'd like to just quickly say that what we were talking about is not perceiving, if I'm not mistaken, perceiving mental illness as the same as physical illness, but just the lack of stigma. What she was discussing is having the same openness toward it so that people did not feel so much stigma that they would not seek help. And I know that it is a whole of society problem to reduce domestic and family violence. My project, however, because I'm just one person, is pretty much the same as if you knew that 1 in 3 people in this room were going to be hit by a car and injured, and some of them killed. I think most of us would not just want drivers to be told, don't hit pedestrians. You'd also want people, you'd want to know for yourself and your family how to cross the road safely. So my program is basically cross the road safely. It is not seen as the solution to all the problems. It is a cultural problem. It is a broader problem. But in the meantime, we're not doing anything to keep women safe. And what I teach them can actually keep women from choosing to be in a relationship with an abuser, identifying him early, and getting out so that their lives aren't ruined. That's it. That does not in any way preclude all the other efforts that we need to make to stop rewarding people for those behaviors. So.
Would any of the other panellists like to pick up that, or we move to the next question? No? Thank you.
I had the benefit of growing up for a few years in an Aboriginal community in Arnhem Land. And I guess while I did see it through the rose-coloured glasses as a kid, I was 8 to 12 when I was up there, I did see a lot of the societal issues. And I was wondering about your thoughts about how unemployment and employment sort of feeds into the issue of respect, and then substance abuse, and then onto domestic violence. And sort of, I guess, some of the parallels you can draw from what happens in Aboriginal communities and how that then can come to the city and tackle the issues of homelessness and how that feeds into it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't kind of speak for all communities, but what we can say is that in terms of the research, there's a kind of two-prong approach to looking at DV or family violence in our communities. And one is behavioural. Behaviour as a consequence of disadvantage. And then secondly, behaviour as a consequence of colonisation and dispossession and all of the kinds of problems that flow on from what is very recent history for Aboriginal people. So if we reflect on the protection era, for example, as Noel Pearson referred to in the Gough Whitlam, his eulogy, the last vestiges of protection were removed in the kind of mid-1970s in far north Queensland. So it's very recent in terms of Aboriginal history. And so that leads to, that's a very complex then matrix in terms of how, in terms of community behaviours. And so a lot of the programs that we developed are then aimed at two things. One is reduction of that violence, and secondly is to, I suppose, increase the resilience of the communities and coping with that kind of behaviour. You noted employment. I mean, there's all sorts of, I suppose, suggestions and ideas and policies and programs that are aimed at ameliorating violence in Aboriginal communities. What we know, though, from one of the most recent UN multi-country studies on violence, which has looked at men's violence and it's an evidence-based analysis of what works and what doesn't work, which is really key, I think, in this space, which is ignored a lot in Australia, has found that a lot of the measures that are taken to address violence in those communities there's no evidence base that they will ever work. So, for example, alcohol prohibition and alcohol measures are at the absolute bottom of this, what is probably the world's, I think, most important study, because there's not a lot of research done around what works and what doesn't work in this field. Alcohol prohibition is down the bottom, poster campaigns down the bottom. Men's and boys groups don't fare too well either. What does seem to work, which is kind of promising emerging evidence, are things like 2 to 3 year programmatic things aimed at particular behaviours that involve men and women, and a number of other measures. But it is interesting to note that a lot of the key measures at the moment in terms of Commonwealth and state policy in those areas with significant violence are not ones that have, any evidence that they will work. And a lot of those were rolled out, for example, in the Northern Territory during the intervention, and they haven't worked. And they're still there. And I think probably because we've gone from, this kind of protection era to self-determination, now we're into this era of what Tony Abbott himself called neo-paternalism. And someone from the government said to me the other day, this is part of the nudge, everybody's a nudge expert these days. This is, this is a part of nudge theory and I said to them, well, it's not at all. It's not some form of clever social engineering. It's a straitjacket. You are literally removing all choice and freedom of humans to make fundamental decisions about their life. And I think that's a really important point when you're looking at Aboriginal communities, is that I think a lot of them are defined by this notion of unfreedom. There's not a lot of freedom in these communities to make choices about your life at all. And it's as far away from self-determination as you can possibly ever get. I don't know if I answered your question, so I tend to ramble.
There's a question down here. Just here, Jeff.
So there's been a lot of talk about the education system and mental health, and being a high school student myself, I was wondering what substantive changes can we actually implement into the education system to be supportive of kids who are dealing with mental health, because I've seen, friends myself not be able to come to school because of dealings with mental health and, struggling through their everyday life of what they go through. So what real substantive changes do you think need to be implemented into the schooling system to create that, positive change?
Who wants to take that what works question? It's a fabulous question. It's what works. What works?
Well, I think one of the main things, and this comes from young people themselves, is wanting to see mental health education integrated within the education system and into the formal education system. So from what I've seen, sometimes you might have, a seminar in Year 9 about mental health, and then like 2 years later you have another afternoon, and that seems like that approach isn't really working. And what we really want to see is an integrated, mainstreamed mental health program that runs from Year 7 to 12 and potentially even starts in primary school. And one of the key recommendations that I've heard from young people is that when these programs are run in schools, it would be really great if young people themselves had the opportunity to be part of the planning for how these programs run. Because I think there is a problem with the existing programs, that they are created by people who perhaps don't really understand what young people are facing, which means that the education that is rolled out, it's not cutting through, it's not hitting the right notes. So I think including young people in the planning process of those workshops is a really great start. And also, peer-led workshops seem to be incredibly effective. So these are issues which are difficult to talk about. I think if you had a safe environment where you had young people being able to facilitate conversations with each other, obviously with the support of mental health professionals who are able to intervene if need be, that would be a really great start. Because it sounds like what you're saying is that we really need to empower young people to deal with these issues themselves. It's not just about, here is a service that you can go and access. Access to services is important, but it's also important to give young people the tools to be able to promote their own well-being and their own resilience. So I think that would be a really good first start.
Yeah, I agree. The ability to create self-resilience and to look after oneself, so that you can identify when your behaviours aren't respectful to yourself and to others is really important. And the issue is, of course, you talk to any of our friends in education, and the first thing that we'll talk about is the crowded curriculum. In order to get that in, something else has got to go. And also, we've just got to be careful, I think, that we don't run the risk of defaulting responsibility away from the family unit. To me, what's the role of education in schools against what's now often the school provides because the family can't, and so there's that conflict as well. But it's a really important proposal that you proffer there, because I think once you lose that ability or you start down that certain path, and just anecdotally, professionally, we're seeing a lot more people present with mental health challenges at a younger age. So the ability to intercede in that early is really important.
Dina, what do you think might work in answer to that question? And it's a secondary curriculum.
I was thinking of the integration, but I also think I'd like to see more. I know that for my Protect Your Daughter seminars, I do it after school hours and insist that the parents come, that the mother comes along. I think that it really does need to be the family working with the school as a single unit. I think it's also important that there's consistency, because you don't want it, right now I think in many ways you're pitting the family against the school. They're learning one thing at home, another thing in school, and that's not treating the family with respect. So resilience, I think what has happened, as someone who is far older than you are, what has happened over the last, I'd say 30, 40 years is that young people are being brought up with not only a sense of entitlement, but having everything done for them. And we really, as a society, need to focus on resilience. I think that was something, the peer-led programs are so successful because it's resilient young people telling their peers, hey, this is how you do it, and they can relate to each other, they can identify with each other. I think we also need to have a lot of access to this stuff online so it can be anonymous for people who don't necessarily want to reveal to a peer at the same school that they're having issues.
And that's being done. There's the Young and Well CR Cooperative Research Centre is working hard on that, to use the campfire around which young people sit to be able to communicate and get help without having to go face to face, which seems a barrier too.
But I'd like to see more cooperation between the schools and the parents.
But I don't want to put a big downer on this one too, but a lot of kids are learning some resilience the very hard way at home because there's so much abuse going on in a lot of homes as well. So, you've got to juggle that, I should think, as well.
I think one of the first things, if I were going to say to improve your mental health, turn off the TV. When talking about issues like ICE, and then I look at the fact that Breaking Bad is such a popular show. And I know when I do my seminars and I talk about things like Rihanna and Beyonce and Kim Kardashian and 50 Shades of Grey and bitch better have my money. Oh God, Rihanna really needs some help. I look at, that people don't understand the connection between what is promoted as a value and how they conduct their own lives. Our brains don't understand what a TV is. It doesn't understand a video. It thinks it's all happening in your life and it's adapting to it. So I think we also need to, I love teaching young people about this because they're so clever. Somebody just has to give them the information and they can run with it. So
we're close to out of time, damn it. Megan, I can see you nodding, so I wanted to just sort of pick up.
Nothing to say. I was just nodding at her. I was just nodding at what she was saying. That's all.
Come on.
Furious agreement.
What works in the class? What do you think would?
Oh, I'm not. That's not my field. I don't know what works in the classroom. So. I'm a
what works in the no? Okay, but we are talking about what works in evidence-based. You were talking about things that didn't work.
I know when my students don't read before class, it's very difficult to. That's about the extent of my classroom knowledge.
Is there a final question?
When I went to school as a child, we had a class every week or every 2 weeks called health. We also had and in that we learned how to blow our nose, wash our hands, all the basic things of growing up in a healthy manner, food. We also had religious instruction. I know it's a contentious point, but nonetheless we learned ethics, values, and so on. Listening to trying to find a solution for the issues that you bring up. If we're not learning these things at home, if it's home where we learn behaviour, I've seen and heard myself yell. I had a father who yelled. And then I realised I have to change my behaviour. If I'm not taught, if I don't have the ability to realise that myself, and if I'm not taught by someone else, which is your tension there, where does the state, where do our systems come into the home? If this is such a big issue, and it seems it is, we're all here talking about it publicly, maybe as a society we do have to decide to take classes like this back into the school curriculum and have them student-led, have the family involved, have the police come in and make it one united class on how to make a respectful society in our multicultural society where it's okay to spit on the ground, where it's okay, as I've heard, to pull your daughter's hair and to allow for them to have operations they may not want. Maybe we can create some strength for the idea of teaching us how to behave in society now, but a formal one. There's an educational style of it's the situation of inquiry, where the children learn and discuss topics, and they're facilitated. It's taught through in philosophy these days, and that system's in some schools to some classes. I'm no expert in it, but I have a friend who is. So I guess I'm trying to find a solution to these very important points. And what do you think of that idea, given that I'm supposed to be asking a question?
Well, the question is kind of back to the future. You know, is that a solution, or could we be eclectic about back to the future? But maybe that's a question we could all answer.
I reckon
the four of
it's
you, and then
really good question for another Melbourne conversation. Engaging some education, because I always think it's dangerous. You know, I'm here as a representative of the police department. I have my own views, but I'm representing the organisation. So to proffer certain opinions on things that aren't within my purview, I think is quite dangerous. But I think it's a really, really interesting question.
It is.
That probably needs more examination than we could give it. That's a chicken's way out, I know. But
Laura, was there more
I'm gonna
peaceful in the past, or?
Follow Glenn's cautiousness and say, speaking from someone who quite recently went through the formal education system, I would have loved to learn more about the things we're talking about today. I would have loved to even do something really simple where you normally have a homeroom every Friday morning, and maybe we just whip around and we talk about a relevant issue that's happening in the community. Maybe that's a way to segue to this position that you're talking about, where we're integrating it more fully into the education system. Or an example I heard just last week from some young people was, let's have a worry box in the classroom. You walk into the classroom, you write down on a piece of paper something that might be worrying you. You can make it anonymous if you want to. You put it in the box, and then at the end of the day, the teacher pulls out one of these worries. So say I'm worried about exams, and the class has a really quick 10 to 15 minute discussion about some strategies to deal with that worry. I think little things like that are probably a way that we can move towards this solution that you've proffered.
Need to have them in our offices as well. Why do all the good things stop when you leave school? I mean, we need anything that's really bad for young people and kids is bad for adults. We tend to just leave people stranded once they leave school, and we shouldn't do that. They should advocate having a worry box and a discussion at an office. I mean, have these corporations, you want to talk about mental health days, feeling like you're actually supported by your colleagues in your workplace would do a lot to help a lot of the issues that people have, even if it only just nudges you to feel supported enough to seek out the help that you need.
might have to get a shipping container, I think, instead of a box.
A worry barrel.
A worry barrel. As long as it doesn't have beer in it, that's okay.
Megan.
I've no idea. Look, a lot of kids don't know how to write. I mean, what I'm trying to say is they're really wired up. My students learn in a very different way to what we learn. I don't know what classrooms will look like in 10 years. They receive their information and digest their information in a very different way to what we did. So I'm not sure the classrooms of old will really fit the classrooms of today or the future. In terms of the curriculum, I mean, this is a very highly politicised space in Australia. You had, I think it was Julia Gillard who undertook the reforms in terms of the national curriculum, which have now just been completely rewritten and adopted last week, I think. It's a complicated thing in terms of Commonwealth territory and the state in terms of education. But in terms of getting those kinds of things, which I suspect you're kind of alluding to, ethics and philosophy and teaching young Australians a different way of thinking, good luck with that. Because, I mean, it wasn't promising what was adopted last week. So, this is something that requires Australians to put pressure on their local members and to use the, democratic representative system to somehow, I suppose, influence what might go into the national curriculum. But the kinds of suggestions you've made have been made for a very long time. And certainly we've had to readjust our law curriculum because our, corporates, etc., will say, we're graduating, not just our university, but most of the law schools in Sydney are graduating, or New South Wales, just volumes of students who can't critically think, who can't write properly, there's real problems with the way in which the education system is calibrated in Australia, but I'm not an expert in that field at all, so I'm like you, I couldn't say much more than that.
We have to wrap it up. It would be very difficult to even begin trying to summarise this. I think perhaps the word respect has been the dominant theme, and at the public policy level, perhaps the greatest expression of respect is the notion of equality of opportunity. from which, you know, which is related to a whole lot of other stuff we've been talking about in terms of education and awareness, and that's respected at a community level. I think another thing that's come through very, very strongly is that peace starts with the individual and with the home and goes out into the community. That way, I don't think you're going to be without a police force anytime soon, sadly. But I think also it's been interesting to look at the context within which we're trying to say, within which people are saying there's a big gap between what is the case and what ought to be the case, notwithstanding we live in the world's most livable city. So I would like to thank in the traditional way, if everybody could join me, thanking Professor Megan Davis, Dr. Dina McMillan, Laura John and Glenn Weir. Thank you so much for your time and your insights tonight.